So I decided I was going to go to law school, finish law school, pass the bar exam, come back to Alabama, and destroy everything segregated I could find.
That was Fred Gray's personal mission in life. Fred Gray, the man who destroyed everything segregated in his path. His contributions to the civil rights movement often go unnoticed because he fought in the courtroom. However, Attorney Gray played a vital role in the famous bus boycott, school desegregation, and voting rights for African Americans. Fred Gray attended Cleveland's Western Reserve University Law School in Ohio because African Americans were not allowed to attend the University of Alabama at the time. He kept his promise, and at the age of 23 years old, and straight out of law school, he returned and quickly started on that quest.
Rosa Parks, a Montgomery resident, was arrested for not giving up her seat on a public bus. The community's decision to use this opportunity to make a public display of the protest was what really mattered.
But the Montgomery situation, unlike what people think, it took a great deal of planning. And the two persons who really planned the details of the Montgomery bus boycott was Joanne Robinson and Fred Gray. And it occurred after Ms. Parks was arrested that day and after I had a call from her and went by and talked with her, and she told me she wanted me to represent her.
They organized a boycott of the bus system which lasted 381 days, and 90% of black people did not ride the Montgomery buses. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., played a major part and used the boycott to raise national awareness. However, Fred Gray's case that brought the end of the boycott and made a lasting impact was Browder v. Gale in 1956. William Gale was the city of Montgomery's mayor, and Aurelia Browder was a housewife. The federal district court ruled in this case that bus segregation was unlawful, but the city and state appealed. This case went to Supreme Court, and in November 1956, the Supreme Court stated that racial segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. Fred Gray, at the age of 24, had bravely shown leadership in desegregating Montgomery's bus system, but there were still many improvements to make.
In 1954, when Brown versus the Board of Education was tried, the judges ruled that all schools be integrated. But, since they did not specify when, the ruling was ignored. 9 years later, Vivian Malone and James Hood wanted to enroll in the University of Alabama, but they were rejected because of the color of their skin. Fred Gray, having already fought school desegregation cases all over the state, was ready to take the challenge. Judge Johnson ruled in their favor, but Governor George Wallace had a different plan.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Wallace came down to the University of Alabama and stood in the schoolhouse door, blocking the way. However, due to the influence of President John F. Kennedy, the governor had to step aside. That same year, Attorney Gray also filed the pivotal case, Lee v. Macon County Board of Education. He won, and the judges ordered the Tuskegee Public School be integrated. The children attending the school and their parents made preparations to accept the new law and were ready to abide by it. But Governor George Wallace interjected again. On September 2, 1963, the children arrived at school, but they found that Wallace had sent state troopers and forced them to close down the school just so it wouldn't be desegregated. The same night that the schools were closed, Attorney Fred Gray gathered his co-workers and started working to limit Governor Wallace by getting a restraining order. Gray realized that if Wallace had enough power to close the schools, he could also have enough to desegregate them. Furthermore, Attorney Gray's arguments and Judge Frank Johnson's blanket ruling were written so that the case had a broad reach and is still effective for relief today. Gray managed to integrate all the public schools in Alabama with just one lawsuit, which also led to the desegregation of Alabama colleges without any direct lawsuit, and integrated the athletic association so the black athletes got the opportunities they deserved. Lee v. Macon County Board of Education's legacy continues to fight discrimination throughout Alabama even today.
Fred Gray's leadership also extended to the battle for voting equality. Many people think of the Selma March, which was in support of voting rights, as one of the most significant moments of the civil rights movement. But even before that event, Fred Gray was already successfully defending African Americans' votes in Southern courts. In October of 1960, the case of Gamillion v. Lightfoot was argued in the U.S. Supreme Court. This case centered on the mayor, Phil Lightfoot, and the City Council of Tuskegee, Alabama, in their plan to redraw the city limits from a simple square to a 28-sided shape, which Attorney Gray called the Sea Dragon, that kept all of the white voters but left out all but a handful of African American residents. Much to the surprise of the Supreme Court judges, the new city limit excluded the Tuskegee Institute, one of the most well-known black colleges in America.
There is the Tuskegee Institute on that map.
Tuskegee Institute is here, in the northwest corner. It is no longer in the city.
That's now us.
The court ruled on November 14, 1960, that the city of Tuskegee's actions violated the 15th Amendment rights of African Americans. As a result, the original city limits were reinstated and local voting rights were restored. This ruling is still applied to gerrymandering cases today. 5 years after the Gamillion v. Lightfoot decision, tensions over voting rights were rising in Selma, Alabama, because many voters were still being blocked from registration. On March 7, 1965, civil rights supporters attempted to march from the state capitol in Montgomery. Because the marchers did not have legal permission to protest, Governor Wallace sent the Alabama state troopers to stop them from crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. The state troopers violently confronted the marchers with force and tear gas. This became known as Bloody Sunday. One day after Bloody Sunday, Fred Gray filed a lawsuit in district court asking permission for the Selma March to continue. On March 9, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. was set to lead the march without court approval, but Attorney Gray convinced King to wait until the court decided the outcome of the case. 2 days later, on March 11th, the court of Judge Johnson ruled that marchers would be allowed to use public highways and that the state of Alabama should provide protection for the marchers. However, Governor Wallace refused, so President Lyndon B. Johnson nationalized the Alabama National Guard to do it. On March 22, 1965, the Selma March began with 3,000 followers and reached Montgomery on March 25th with over 25,000 marchers. The national publicity of this march fueled Congress's quick passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Fred Gray's legal expertise helped make the Selma March and the one-man, one-vote movement a reality. Never stopping in his pursuit of justice, Attorney Gray also won a $10 million settlement and received a formal apology from then-President Clinton for the survivors of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study in 1972.
What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
After the Tuskegee study, the National Research Act was signed into law.
Great friend of freedom, Fred Gray, thank you for fighting this long battle all these long years.
In 1979, Fred Gray became one of the first African Americans elected as an Alabama state legislator since the Reconstruction. In 1985, he was the first African American chosen to be the president of the Alabama Bar Association. In February of this past year, he was recognized for his leadership with his own historical marker in Alabama. Fred Gray has pursued his goal of destroying segregation by taking the lead in the courtroom and fighting for the laws that made a lasting impact. Martin Luther King Jr. once described Attorney Gray as the brilliant young Negro who later became the chief counsel for the protest movement. Today, Attorney Gray is 84 years old and continues to fight for equality, even as he looks back at his accomplishments. As he said at the anniversary of the bus boycott, "My interest and my concern is not so much to commemorate what happened 50 years ago, but to look at where we are now. We have to realize racism is not going to go away by itself." In response to Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, Fred Gray challenges each of us to follow his lead by saying, "Dreams are good. What's the first thing you need to do to make a dream come true? Wake up.
Everybody free, love, free. Someday